A blind man was being attacked by thieves in broad daylight when something unexpected happened. The neighborhood bull jumped in and changed everything. What he did in that moment shocked everyone, and the ending is even more unbelievable. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single detail of this insane story. In the secluded hills of rural Kentucky, where time seemed to follow its own unhurried rhythm, Thomas Blackwood had carved out a life, defined not by what he lacked, but by what he possessed in abundance, dignity, skill, and an extraordinary sensitivity to the world around him. At 42, Thomas had been blind for nearly 2 decades, the result of a logging accident that had claimed his sight but never his independence. His small cabin stood at the edge of Whispering Pines, a town so small it barely warranted a spot on the state map, and yet within its boundaries existed a tightly woven community where everyone knew not just each other's names, but their stories. Thomas lived alone, save for Sadie, his loyal golden retriever guide dog, whose presence was as constant as his own shadow. His hands, calloused and steady, crafted intricate wooden sculptures and woven baskets that he sold at the weekly Saturday market in town. Local residents and occasional tourists marveled at how a man who couldn't see could create such delicate, beautiful pieces. What they didn't understand was that Thomas's fingers had become his eyes, perceiving textures and contours with a precision that sometimes surpassed visual perception. His world was composed entirely of sounds, smells, and textures. Each morning, Thomas oriented himself to the day by the familiar symphony that played outside his window. The cheerful warble of robins in the oak tree, the distant rumble of Hank, Miller's truck heading to his dairy farm, and most distinctly, the powerful resonant bellow of Thunderclap, the massive Hereford bull that resided on Ray Henderson's property adjacent to his own. "Morning, old friend," Thomas would often mutter toward the sound, though the bull was separated from him by a sturdy fence and a stretch of meadow. There was something comforting about Thunderclap's predictable morning greeting, a bass note in the orchestration of his day. Ray Henderson had owned the neighboring property for as long as Thomas had lived there. A gruff, hard-working cattle rancher with little time for idle conversation, Ray nevertheless maintained a respectful relationship with Thomas. They weren't friends exactly, but shared the bond of 2 solitary men who understood the value of independence. "Thunderclap's acting ornery today," Ray would sometimes mention when they crossed paths at the general store. "Weather's changing." Thomas would nod, having already noticed subtle changes in the bull's vocalizations. "He's been moving differently too, heavier on his right side." Ray never questioned how Thomas knew such things. In truth, the blind man's observations about Thunderclap had proven more accurate than Ray's own visual assessments on more than one occasion. Life in Whispering Pines proceeded with the predictable cadence of rural America: church on Sundays, potluck socials at the community center once a month, and the weekly farmers market where locals traded not just goods but news and gossip. It was at one such market that Thomas first heard whispers of trouble. Third tool shed broken into this month. Thomas overheard Martha Wilson telling someone as he arranged his wares on a wooden table. Jim's tractor parts vanished right out of his locked barn. Strange things happening, agreed Betty Collins, who sold homemade jams and preserves at the stall beside his. Sheriff Wilson says it might be those drifters that passed through last week. Thomas said nothing, simply nodding politely when Betty addressed him directly. But he filed the information away, attuning himself to the subtle undercurrent of unease that had begun to permeate the normally tranquil community. That evening, as Thomas walked the familiar path home with Sadie leading the way, he sensed something different in the air. The usual sounds seemed muted, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. Even Thunderclap's evening bellow seemed shorter, tenser somehow. Thomas paused at his gate, head tilted in the direction of Ray's property. Something's not right, he murmured to Sadie, who whined softly in response. That night, Thomas was awakened by Sadie's low growl. He sat up, instantly alert, every sense straining. There, a soft crunch of gravel outside his workshop, the subtle creak of a door he was certain he had locked. Moving silently, Thomas reached for the walking stick he kept beside his bed and made his way to the front door. Sadie pressed against his leg. He stood there listening intently, but whoever or whatever had been there was gone. In the morning, he discovered that several of his finished pieces, ones he had completed for special orders, were missing from the workshop. Thomas didn't report the theft. Something held him back. Perhaps the awareness that as a blind man living alone, any admission of vulnerability might lead to well-meaning but unwanted interventions in his carefully constructed independence. Instead, he reinforced his locks and began paying closer attention to the sounds around his property, particularly at night. What he noticed disturbed him. Unfamiliar footsteps that appeared and disappeared at odd hours, the occasional whispered conversation at the edge of his property, and something else. Thunderclap's behavior was changing. The bull had always been vocal, but now he seemed to pace more at night, his movements agitated, almost as if he too sensed the invisible intrusion into their shared space. Sheriff Wilson stopped by a few days later, his cruiser announcing his arrival with its distinctive engine purr. "Just checking in on you, Thomas," the sheriff said, his voice carrying the practiced ease of a man accustomed to community policing. "Had some reports of missing items throughout the area. Anything unusual around here?" Thomas hesitated, his fingers working a piece of reed he'd been weaving. "Nothing worth bothering about," he finally said. "Sadie's been a bit restless at night, but that could be anything. Raccoons, maybe." The sheriff seemed satisfied with this, but as he was leaving, he added, "You take care now. Any problems, you just call the station. Mary'll dispatch me right quick." After the sheriff left, Thomas sat on his porch, fingers absently stroking Sadie's fur as he turned his face toward the afternoon sun. He could hear Thunderclap moving along the fence line, closer than usual. The bull's deep breathing carried across the distance, and Thomas had the strangest feeling that the animal was listening too, both of them sentinels in their own way. That evening, as Thomas prepared for bed, Sadie suddenly stiffened beside him, her body alert. A moment later, Thomas heard it too, the unmistakable sound of Thunderclap charging the fence, wood splintering under tremendous force, followed by a cacophony of startled human voices and running feet. By the time Thomas made it to his door, the night had returned to silence, save for Thunderclap's heavy breathing somewhere much closer than he should have been. Curious and concerned, Thomas whistled softly, a habit from his youth when he'd worked summers at his uncle's farm. To his surprise, he heard the bull pause, then slowly approach, stopping just short of the porch steps. Thomas stood perfectly still, a forgotten memory stirring at the edges of his consciousness. "Well now," he murmured, "what's gotten into you, old fellow?" The bull snorted softly, a sound Thomas could have sworn carried recognition. And in that moment, something shifted in Thomas's understanding of his world, a world that suddenly seemed to hold more mysteries and connections than he had imagined. The real question was what to do with this realization, and what it might mean for the disruptions that had begun to ripple through the quiet fabric of Whispering Pines. Morning arrived with the soft patter of rain against Thomas's window, a gentle rhythm that masked the usual sounds of daybreak. He moved with practiced precision through his cabin, fingers trailing along familiar surfaces as he prepared coffee. His mind kept returning to the previous night's strange encounter with Thunderclap. There was something about the bull's behavior that tugged at memories long buried, fragments of a time before darkness had become his constant companion. Ray Henderson's truck pulled up before Thomas had finished his first cup of coffee. The rancher's heavy footsteps splashed through puddles as he approached the porch. "Your dog all right?" Ray called out, voice gruff with concern. Thunderclap broke through the fence last night. Darned if I know why. Never done anything like that before. Thomas opened the door, Sadie alert at his side. We're fine. Heard the commotion, though. Sounded like he might have scared off someone. There was a pause, and Thomas could almost feel Ray's scrutinizing gaze. Someone? You having trouble out here, Thomas? Just speculating, Thomas replied, offering a neutral smile. Coffee's fresh if you want some. The unexpected invitation hung in the air for a moment before Ray grunted an acceptance. Inside, as rain drummed against the roof, the two men sat at Thomas's small kitchen table, an unusual break in their typical neighborly distance. Been meaning to ask, Ray said after a while. How'd you learn to make those crafts of yours? Impressive work for anyone, let alone. A blind man? Thomas finished with a slight smile. My grandmother taught me basketry when I was a boy. The woodwork came later after the accident. Needed something to do with my hands. Ray made a sound of acknowledgement. Must have been rough, losing your sight like. And that. Thomas's fingers traced the rim of his mug. It was. For a long time I thought my life was over. Then I realized it was just different. He paused, considering his next words carefully. I worked with animals before, you know. Had a way with them, people said. That's so? Ray sounded genuinely interested. What kind? All kinds. Grew up on my uncle's farm in eastern Kentucky. Had horses, cattle, even a few exotic creatures for a small local zoo he consulted for. Thomas leaned back in his chair. There was a young bull I trained once, stubborn as they come. Used a special whistle technique my uncle taught me. Rain filled the silence that followed, and Thomas sensed Ray shifting in his seat. Thunderclap was a rescue, Ray finally said. Bought him at auction 5 years back. Previous owner was from eastern Kentucky too, if I recall. Said the bull was already trained, but never mentioned how. A chill ran through Thomas that had nothing to do with the rain. What was the name of the owner? Wilkins, I think. Jim or John Wilkins. Thomas set his mug down carefully. Joseph Wilkins, my uncle. The revelation hung between them, a bridge suddenly constructed across years of casual neighborliness. Before either could explore this connection further, Sadie's head jerked up, ears alert. A moment later, Thomas heard the distinct sound of a vehicle approaching, unfamiliar, not from town. Ray stood. Expecting company? No, Thomas replied, rising as well. Sheriff, maybe? But it wasn't Sheriff Wilson. The vehicle, a truck, by the sound of the engine, stopped at Thomas's gate. 2 doors opened and closed, followed by the squelch of boots on the rain-soaked path. Mr. Blackwood, called an unfamiliar male voice. Sorry to bother you in this weather. We're from the Bluegrass Historical Society. Hope we might have a word. Thomas moved to the door, Sadie close beside him, feeling Ray's solid presence at his back. Something about the situation made him uneasy, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Kind of a strange time for a historical society visit, Ray muttered. Behind him, Thomas nodded slightly in agreement, but opened the door anyway. Gentlemen, he greeted, what can I do for the Historical Society on a rainy Tuesday? We're documenting traditional crafts in the region, said the man, his voice smooth and practiced. Your work came highly recommended. A second man spoke, his voice higher, nervous. We'd love to see your workshop if possible. Maybe take some photos for our publication. Thomas hesitated, his instincts humming with warning. In all his years selling at the market, no historical society had ever expressed interest in his work. Before he could respond, Ray stepped forward. Why? Don't you fellas come back another time? Ray suggested, his tone making it clear this wasn't really a suggestion. Mr. Blackwood here has commitments today. There was a tense pause before the first man responded, his affable tone slightly strained. Of course. Perhaps later this week. We're only in the area for a short time. Thomas nodded non-committally. You can leave your card. I'll be in touch if my schedule opens up. After an awkward exchange of pleasantries, the men departed. Thomas listened to their truck pull away, frowning slightly. "You know those men?" Ray asked, once they were alone. "Never heard them before," Thomas replied, "and no historical society called ahead to arrange a visit." Ray made a contemplative sound. "Strange coincidence, them showing up right after Thunderclap breaks through a fence for the first time in 5 years. Later, after Ray had left to repair the damaged fence, Thomas sat on his porch swing, listening to the rain tapering off. His thoughts kept circling back to the revelation about Thunderclap. Could it really be the same bull he had helped train as a young man before losing his sight? The timing matched. His accident had been 18 years ago, and a bull could easily live 20 years or more. Thomas reached for a small wooden box beside him, fingers finding the hidden release mechanism that opened it. Inside was a whistle, hand-carved from oak, a relic from his past he'd kept more out of sentiment than any practical purpose. It produced a particular pitch, almost beyond human hearing, but perfectly tuned to bovine ears. His uncle had taught him to use it as part of a training method that had been remarkably effective. Standing, whistle in hand, Thomas made his way carefully to the side of his property that bordered Ray's land. The fence would be 100 yards. Ahead and beyond that, if his sense of direction was correct, would be the pasture where Thunderclap usually grazed. Thomas hesitated, feeling suddenly foolish. It had been nearly 2 decades since he'd used this whistle. The chances that this bull, even if it was from his uncle's farm, would remember a training command from so long ago were virtually non-existent. Still, something compelled him forward. Raising the whistle to his lips, Thomas blew 3 short bursts followed by 1 long note, the command for approach. Then he stood perfectly still, listening. The minutes stretched out, filled only with the drip of rainwater from leaves and the distant call of birds. Then he heard it, the deliberate movement of a heavy body through wet grass, coming closer. Steady, purposeful footsteps that stopped just on the other side of where the fence should be. "Thunderclap?" Thomas called softly. A loud snort answered him, followed by the unmistakable sound of the bull pawing at the ground with 1 hoof, exactly as Thomas had trained his uncle's bulls to do in acknowledgement. Thomas's heart raced. It wasn't possible. And yet, he lifted the whistle again and blew a different pattern, 2 long, 1 short. It was the command for turn right he had used all those years ago. The sound of movement came again, and Thomas could tell that the bull had indeed turned to the right, just as commanded. "My God," he whispered. This was no coincidence. This was genuine recognition, a connection that had somehow survived across time and darkness. As the implications of this discovery cascaded through his mind, Thomas became aware of another sound, footsteps approaching along the road. Lighter than Ray's, but purposeful. Thomas quickly pocketed the whistle and turned toward the newcomer. "Mr. Blackwood?" It was a woman's voice, familiar. Lily Carson, who ran the local general store. "Sheriff Wilson asked me to check on you on my way home. Said there've been some suspicious folks around." "I'm fine, Lily," Thomas assured her, though his mind was still reeling from what had just happened with Thunderclap, just getting some fresh air after the rain. "Well, you be careful," she advised. "Jim Parker had his storage shed broken into last night, more tools gone missing. Sheriff thinks it might be organized, targeted thefts, not just random." Thomas nodded, thanking her for the information. As Lily continued on her way, he stood for a moment, considering the strange convergence of events, the thefts, the mysterious visitors, and now the astonishing connection with Thunderclap. Something was happening in Whispering Pines that went beyond simple coincidence. The scattered pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though its full shape remained elusive. As Thomas made his way back to his cabin, he felt a certainty growing within him. Whatever was coming, he and Thunderclap were somehow at the center of it. connected by bonds that neither time nor darkness had managed to sever. Thomas spent the following days in a state of heightened awareness, his senses attuned to every unusual sound and shift in the atmosphere around his property. The discovery of his connection with Thunderclap had awakened something in him, memories and skills long dormant, preserved like insects in amber during the years he'd focused solely on adapting to blindness and building his new life. Each morning, he walked to the repaired section of fence where Ray had installed a gate, ostensibly to make checking the boundary easier. Both men knew the real reason, though neither spoke it aloud. Thomas was reconnecting with Thunderclap, testing the limits of their renewed relationship. "I'd swear that bull understands every word you say," Ray commented one evening, having observed Thomas and Thunderclap's interaction from a distance. The two neighbors sat on Thomas's porch, a habit that had formed unexpectedly in the wake of their shared discovery. Thomas smiled, fingers wrapped around a glass of iced tea. "Not words so much as tones and patterns. My uncle believed animals perceive intention more clearly than we do. They're not distracted by language." "Your uncle sounds like a wise man," Ray said. "Whatever happened to him?" Thomas's smile faded. "He passed on about 10 years after I left Kentucky. The farm was sold off in pieces. I always wondered what happened to his animals." He paused. "Never imagined one of them would end up living next door to me." The conversation drifted to other topics, but Thomas remained preoccupied with questions about how Thunderclap had found his way to Ray's farm. The coincidence seemed too great, like pieces of a puzzle that had arranged themselves while no one was watching. Wednesday morning brought the weekly delivery from the general store. Thomas recognized Lily Carson's assistant's footsteps on the porch, Danny Miller, a high school kid who worked part-time. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood," Danny called out cheerfully. "Got your usual order, plus Mrs. Carson threw in some of that blackberry jam you like. Said it's on the house." Thomas thanked him, helping to bring the groceries inside. As they unloaded the items onto the counter, Danny's normally talkative nature seemed subdued. "Everything all right, Danny?" Thomas asked, sensing the boy's unease. Danny hesitated. "Probably nothing, Mr. Blackwood, but I saw those historical society guys in town again yesterday. They were asking Martha at the diner about you, when you come to town, who you talk to, that kind of thing." Thomas stilled. "Did they now? And what did Martha tell them?" "Not much. You know how protective she is of everyone in town." Danny's voice lowered. "But later, I saw them parked down the road from your place, just sitting there in their truck. Made me uncomfortable, so I mentioned it to Sheriff Wilson." "I appreciate that, Danny." Thomas kept his tone casual, not wanting to alarm the boy further. "Probably just doing their research, but it's good to keep the sheriff informed." After Danny left, Thomas checked his supplies of wood and reed for the coming week. The Saturday market was his primary source of income, and he needed to have enough finished pieces to make it worth the trip. As he worked in his shop that afternoon, his thoughts kept returning to the stranger's interest in him. It seemed excessive for representatives of a historical society, especially given that his crafting skills, while good, were hardly unique enough to warrant such attention. The afternoon was waning when Sadie suddenly raised her head from where she'd been dozing near the workshop door. A low, warning growl rumbled in her throat. Thomas froze, listening. At first, he heard nothing unusual, but then the subtle crunch of careful footsteps circling toward the back of his property. Thomas reached for his cane, moving silently to the door. Sadie pressed against his leg, still growling softly. He waited, tracking the movement outside by sound. Whoever it was had stopped at the rear corner of his workshop near the window. Thomas heard the whisper of fabric against wood, the subtle clicks of what might have been a camera. Making a quick decision, Thomas pushed the door open with more force than necessary, creating a loud bang as it hit the exterior wall. "Can I help you?" he called sharply. Startled movement, a muffled curse, and then rapid footsteps retreating around the building. Thomas moved to follow, Sadie leading him, but the intruder was already running down the road. The sound of a vehicle starting up came shortly after, the same engine he'd heard when the supposed Historical Society representatives had visited. Thomas stood in his yard, pulse racing as the vehicle sped away. The encounter left him shaken, not out of fear for himself, but because of the disturbing implications. These men weren't simply curious about his crafts, they were surveilling him for reasons he couldn't fathom. Later that evening, as darkness settled over the hills, Thomas sat on his porch with Sadie beside him, the familiar weight of the carved whistle in his pocket, a strange comfort. The sound of Ray's distinctive gait approached from the direction of the shared property line. "Thought I heard a commotion earlier," Ray said without preamble. "Everything all right?" Thomas related the afternoon's events, his concern evident in his voice. "These aren't Historical Society representatives, Ray. They're too interested in me personally, not my work." Ray was silent for a moment. "You think this is connected to the thefts around town?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but it can't be coincidence that they showed up right when Thunderclap broke through the fence." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Sheriff Wilson's cruiser pulling up to Thomas's gate. The sheriff's heavy tread came up the path, accompanied by the jingle of keys on his belt. "Evening, Thomas, Ray," Sheriff Wilson greeted them. "Got a minute to talk, Thomas?" The seriousness in the sheriff's tone was unmistakable. Thomas gestured to the empty chair on the porch. "Of course, something wrong?" "Maybe, maybe not." "Udas." The wooden chair creaked as the sheriff settled his considerable weight into it. "Had a report today about those Historical Society folks who visited you. Checked with the actual Bluegrass Historical Society. They don't have any representatives in this area right now, and they're not doing any documentation project on traditional crafts." A chill ran down Thomas's spine, despite the warm evening. "So they're imposters?" "Appears so." The sheriff's voice was grave. "Now, it could be they're just opportunists casing places for valuables. We've had similar reports in neighboring counties, but the fact they singled you out concerns me." "Danny mentioned they were asking about Thomas in town," Ray put in. "And Thomas caught one of them snooping around his workshop today." The sheriff made a troubled sound. "That escalates things. I'm going to increase patrols in this area for the time being. And Thomas, I'd suggest staying with a friend in town for a few days, just until we figure out what these fellas want." Thomas shook his head firmly. "I appreciate the concern, Sheriff, but I'm not leaving my home. This is where I can function independently. Anywhere else, I'd be at a disadvantage." There was a pause, and Thomas could almost feel the concerned looks being exchanged between Ray and the sheriff. "At least let me leave a deputy nearby," Sheriff Wilson insisted, "just as a precaution." Thomas reluctantly agreed to this compromise, though the idea of being watched over, even for his protection, chafed against his hard-won independence. After the sheriff left, Ray remained, an unusual tension in his silence. "You're worried?" Thomas observed. "Damn right I am," Ray replied bluntly. "These aren't your ordinary troublemakers, Thomas. They're too organized, too focused. I don't like it." Thomas nodded slowly. "I've been thinking, what if this isn't about me at all? What if it's about Thunderclap?" Ray made a skeptical sound. "The bull, why would anyone care about him?" "I'm not sure," Thomas admitted, "but my uncle's training methods were unusual, valuable too. There were people who tried to buy his techniques, offered him good money, but he always refused to sell, said in the wrong hands they could be misused." The night deepened around them as they considered the implications of this theory. Eventually, Ray left, promising to keep an eye on things from his side of the property. Thomas remained on the porch long after listening to the night sounds and turning possibilities over in his mind. Just as he was preparing to go inside, Sadie stiffened beside him. Thomas froze, listening intently. There, a soft sound at a gate, not the clear approach of someone walking up his path, but something being placed carefully against the wood. He waited, tracking the retreating footsteps until they faded completely, before cautiously making his way down to the gate. Sadie, guiding him, his searching fingers found a small package leaning against the gatepost. It was rectangular, wrapped in cloth, and surprisingly heavy for its size. Back inside, Thomas carefully unwrapped the package on his kitchen table. It contained a wooden box, finely crafted with a sliding lid. Inside the box, his exploring fingers found something that made his blood run cold, a small carved whistle, almost identical to the one he carried, alongside a folded piece of paper. Thomas couldn't read the note, of course, but he sensed its importance was dire. Early the next morning, he asked Lily Carson to read it to him when she stopped by with a special order of flour. Her voice faltered as she read the typewritten message. The training system must be surrendered. We know its value and its origin. Cooperation ensures safety. Resistance ensures consequences. You are being watched. The threat was clear, but its precise meaning remained obscure. What exactly did they want him to surrender? The whistle? The training techniques? Both? And who were they? As Lily left, visibly shaken by what she'd read, Thomas stood in his doorway, the weight of the mysterious threat settling around him like a shroud. One thing was certain: Saturday's market day would not be the routine affair it had always been. Whatever was coming, Thomas sensed it was approaching rapidly, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, pregnant with possibilities both threatening and transformative. Saturday dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect late spring day that typically brought the entire community of Whispering Pines to the weekly market. Thomas rose earlier than usual, his sleep having been fitful and interrupted by Sadie's occasional alerts to noises outside, some real, some perhaps imagined, in the tension of recent days. Sheriff Wilson had followed through on his promise, stationing Deputy Roberts in a patrol car near Thomas's property overnight. Thomas had heard the young deputy making periodic walks around the perimeter, his footsteps distinct in their purposeful rhythm. The presence was meant to be reassuring, but Thomas found it had the opposite effect, underscoring the reality of the threat that had invaded his carefully constructed life. As he prepared his wares for market, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was approaching a turning point. The threatening note weighed heavily on his mind, its demands as puzzling as they were menacing. What exactly did these people want? The training techniques themselves were nothing extraordinary on the surface. It was the specific application, the subtle understanding of animal behavior that had made his uncle's methods special. "You're not actually considering going to town today, are you?" Ray's voice interrupted Thomas's thoughts. The rancher had appeared at the workshop door unannounced, having walked across the connected properties. Thomas continued wrapping a delicate ashwood sculpture in protective cloth. "I have orders to deliver, Ray. Can't afford to miss market day." After that threatening note, Ray's voice held disbelief. "These aren't idle threats, Thomas. Whoever these people are, they're serious." "All the more reason not to hide," Thomas replied, his tone firmer than he felt. "Besides, I'll be in the middle of town, surrounded by people, not much they can do there." Ray made a non-committal sound that conveyed his disagreement clearly enough. "At least let me drive you in, and I'm staying at the market." Thomas knew better than to argue. In truth, he welcomed the company, though he'd never admit it aloud. His independence had always been a point of pride, but pride wouldn't help him identify strangers watching from a distance. As they loaded Thomas's crafts into Ray's truck, the familiar sound of Thunderclap's morning bellow echoed across the property. Thomas paused, head tilted toward the sound. "He seems agitated today," Thomas observed. Been that way since dawn, Ray confirmed, moving along the fence line more than usual, almost like he's patrolling. The observation sent a chill through Thomas. Animals had instincts humans had largely forgotten, senses that detected threats before they fully materialized. If Thunderclap was unsettled, perhaps there was good reason. The drive to town passed in relative silence, each man absorbed in his own thoughts. As they approached the central square where the market was held every Saturday, Thomas could sense the usual bustle of activity. Vendors setting up stalls, early customers already browsing, the mingled sense of fresh produce, baked goods, and coffee from Martha's Diner. Busy today, Ray commented, helping Thomas unload his wares at his regular spot near the old oak tree. Lot of unfamiliar voices too. Thomas nodded, having already noted the presence of strangers mixed among the familiar cadences of local residents. The tourist season was beginning, bringing day trippers from Lexington and other nearby cities. Usually, Thomas welcomed these visitors. They often paid premium prices for his authentic Appalachian crafts. Today, however, each unfamiliar voice carried potential threat. Setting up his display took practiced precision. Thomas had a system, arranging pieces by size and type, ensuring he could identify each by touch when customers showed interest. Despite his heightened anxiety, the familiar routine was soothing, grounding him in normalcy even as he remained alert to his surroundings. The morning progressed without incident. Regular customers stopped by to chat and make purchases. New voices expressed admiration for his work, asking about techniques and materials. Ray maintained a constant presence nearby, occasionally describing particularly interested browsers in a low murmur only Thomas could hear. Family with 2 kids, looking at your bird sculptures. Elderly couple, she's interested in the reed baskets. Man in a business suit, just watching, not touching anything. It was approaching noon when Thomas felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Ray's description of market-goers had paused, and Thomas could sense his neighbor's sudden tension. "What is it?" Thomas asked quietly. "Those 2 men just entered the square," Ray replied, voice low. "The ones who claimed to be from the Historical Society." Thomas nodded slightly, continuing to work on a small weaving he'd brought to demonstrate his technique. "What are they doing?" "Just walking around, looking at different stalls. Casual-like, but they keep glancing this way." Ray shifted his position, moving slightly closer to Thomas. "One of them is talking to Sheriff Wilson now." The information was concerning but not unexpected. Thomas had anticipated they might appear at the market. It was, after all, a public gathering where their presence wouldn't seem out of place. He continued his weaving, maintaining the appearance of unconcern, while his other senses remained on high alert. As the day wore on, Thomas became aware of another presence hovering near his stall. Lily Carson, who had positioned herself at the neighboring table selling preserves, though it wasn't her usual spot. "Thought you could use an extra pair of eyes," she murmured when passing close to him. "Those men give me the creeps." Thomas smiled in her direction, touched by the protective instincts his situation had awakened in his friends and neighbors. Whispering Pines might be small, but its sense of community ran deep. It was late afternoon when Thomas heard the approach of footsteps he'd been both dreading and expecting, the distinctive gait of one of the men who had visited his property. "Mr. Blackwood," the man greeted, his voice carrying the same forced affability as before. "Remarkable work you do here. I'm particularly interested in your techniques." Thomas inclined his head slightly. "Thank you. Most of these methods have been passed down through generations. Buju, yes, family traditions can be so valuable," the man replied, a new edge to his tone. "Did you receive our message? We're very interested in acquiring certain traditional knowledge you possess." The veiled reference to the threatening note confirmed Thomas's suspicions. He maintained his composed expression, aware of Ray's tense presence beside him and Lily's watchful gaze from nearby. "I'm afraid I'm not in the business of selling techniques," Thomas replied evenly. "Only the finished products." The man leaned closer, voice dropping to ensure only Thomas could hear. "Reconsider carefully, Mr. Blackwood. Our organization is prepared to pay generously or take what we need by less pleasant means." Before Thomas could respond, Sheriff Wilson's authoritative voice cut through the tension. "Everything all right here, Thomas?" The stranger straightened immediately, his demeanor shifting to casual interest. "Just admiring the craftwork, Sheriff. True artistry." "Indeed it is," the sheriff agreed, though Thomas could hear the suspicion in his tone. "Our Mr. Blackwood is quite the local treasure. We're all mighty protective of him." The implied warning was clear. The stranger made a non-committal sound before moving away, but Thomas had no doubt the confrontation had merely been postponed, not avoided. As the market began to wind down and vendors started packing their unsold goods, Thomas found himself surrounded by a protective circle of community members. Ray, Lily, Sheriff Wilson, and even Martha from the diner had positioned themselves strategically around his stall. "I've arranged a dinner at the diner," Martha announced. "Sort of an impromptu community meeting. Thought we might all walk over together." Thomas understood the underlying purpose, safety in numbers, and nodded in agreement. As they packed his remaining crafts into Ray's truck, Sheriff Wilson approached. "Those Imvellas left town about 20 minutes ago," he informed them quietly. "Deputy Collins is following at a distance just to make sure they keep going." The news should have been reassuring, but Thomas felt a growing unease. Something about the men's departure seemed too convenient, too easy after the veiled threat. The short walk to Martha's diner passed without incident, the early evening air filled with conversation that deliberately avoided mentioning the strangers or their interest in Thomas. Inside the warmth of the diner, with its familiar smells of coffee and Martha's famous pot roast, the tension began to dissipate slightly. As they settled around pushed-together tables, Sheriff Wilson finally addressed the situation directly. "I've been making some calls about those two. They're connected to a private research organization called Behavioral Dynamics Institute. Supposedly, they develop training methods for service animals, but there have been rumors about government contracts, behavior modification research, that sort of thing." "What would they want with Thomas's techniques?" Lily asked, passing a basket of bread around the table. Thomas sighed, feeling the weight of all eyes turning toward him. "My uncle developed a unique method for training animals, particularly livestock, to respond to specific audio cues. Subtle whistles, tones most humans can barely detect. The animals could be directed from a distance, trained to perform complex tasks or behaviors on command." "Like how you communicate with Thunderclap," Ray observed. Thomas nodded. "Exactly. My uncle always said the technique had potential beyond farm use, but he was protective of it, didn't want it exploited." The conversation continued as they ate, theories being proposed and discarded about why the Institute would be so interested in these techniques now, years after his uncle's passing. None of the explanations fully satisfied Thomas, who sensed there was a piece of the puzzle still missing. Darkness had fallen by the time they finished dinner. The original plan had been for Ray to drive Thomas home, but at Sheriff Wilson's insistence, Deputy Roberts would follow in a patrol car, an added precaution that Thomas no longer felt inclined to refuse. As they prepared to leave, Martha squeezed Thomas's hand. "You be careful, you hear? And remember, you've got all of us behind you." The drive back to Thomas's cabin was quiet. The headlights of Deputy Roberts's patrol car, a constant presence in Ray's rearview mirror. Thomas sat with Sadie beside him, one hand resting on her fur, the other clutching the carved whistle in his pocket, a talisman against whatever might await them at journey's end. As they approached the final bend in the road before Thomas's property, Ray suddenly tensed, slowing the truck. "Something's not right," he muttered. "There's a vehicle pulled off to the side up ahead." Thomas leaned forward, straining his ears. In the distance he could hear it, Thunderclap's distinctive bellow, but not his usual evening call. This was different, agitated, almost frantic. "Something's wrong," Thomas said urgently. "That's Thunderclap's warning. He's distressed." Ray accelerated again, taking the final curve faster than usual. As they pulled up to Thomas's gate, the deputy's car close behind, the scene before them became clear, the strange truck. Parked haphazardly at the edge of the property, the front door of Thomas's cabin standing open, and the unmistakable sounds of struggle coming from within. Ray cut the engine, his voice tight with urgency. "Stay here, Thomas." But Thomas was already opening the door, Sadie alert and bristling beside him. "It's my home, Ray. I know it better than anyone, especially in the dark." The deputy's car pulled up behind them, lights flashing but sirens silent. Thomas heard the quick release of Deputy Roberts' holster as the young officer approached. "I'll go in first," Roberts insisted, voice professional but tense. "Mr. Henderson, you flank left. Mr. Blackwood, please stay back until—" His instruction was cut short by a tremendous crash from inside the cabin, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Thomas recognized it instantly. Someone had upended his workshop table where his tools and finished pieces were arranged. Another sound rose above the commotion. Thunderclap's bellowing was getting closer, more frantic. The bull had somehow escaped Ray's pasture again, drawn by the disturbance at Thomas's property. "The bull's loose," Ray warned, but Thomas was already moving, drawing the carved whistle from his pocket. 3 short blasts, the command to approach but remain calm, echoed through the night air. The effect was immediate. Thunderclap's movements shifted from chaotic to purposeful, still approaching but at a measured pace. Thomas turned toward his cabin, Sadie guiding him unerringly along the familiar path. Behind him, he heard Deputy Roberts radioing urgently for backup. "Thomas, for God's sake," Ray called after him, but Thomas continued forward, guided by an instinct deeper than caution. As he reached the porch steps, the cabin door burst open. Thomas could hear at least 2 people stumbling out, their breathing labored, movements uncoordinated with haste. "This way," one of them hissed, a voice Thomas recognized from the market. "We've got what we came for." Thomas stood his ground, blocking their path. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," he said calmly, despite the hammering of his heart. There was a moment of startled silence before the lead intruder spoke, his voice hardening. "Step aside, Mr. Blackwood. We've been authorized to acquire this material by any means necessary." "Material," Thomas echoed. "You mean my uncle's research journals, the ones you just ransacked my home to find?" The man's surprise was palpable in his sharp intake of breath. "How did you know that you were looking for the journals, not just the whistle technique?" Thomas finished for him. "Because my uncle's methods were never written down in full, only fragments, hints. The real knowledge was passed through demonstration, through relationship. The journals themselves are worthless without the understanding behind them." Thomas could sense Ray and Deputy Roberts moving to flank the intruders, cutting off their escape route to the parked truck. But he knew these men were desperate enough to be dangerous. He needed to keep them talking, distracted. "Your institute has been chasing these techniques for years, haven't they?" Thomas continued. "Ever since my uncle refused to sell to you. You tracked the animals from his farm after it was sold, hoping to reverse engineer the training. When you discovered one of those animals was here near me, his nephew and apprentice, you thought you'd hit the jackpot." The second man shifted nervously. "Palmer, we need to go, now." But the lead intruder, Palmer, seemed fixated on Thomas. "You're blind," he said, confusion evident in his voice. "You couldn't possibly still use the techniques effectively." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "Blindness enhanced my other senses, made me more attuned to the subtle variations in sound that form the basis of my uncle's method. In some ways, I've improved on his techniques." A low, rumbling sound interrupted the confrontation. Thunderclap had arrived, his massive form perceivable even to Thomas by the vibrations of his movement and the sound of his breathing. The bull stopped just at the edge of the yard, awaiting instruction. Thomas raised the whistle to his lips again, this time producing a complex series of notes almost beyond human hearing range. Thunderclap responded immediately, moving with deliberate precision to position himself between the intruders and their vehicle. "What are you doing?" Palmer's voice had lost its confidence, edged now with uncertainty. "Demonstrating," Thomas replied simply. "What you've been searching for isn't something you can steal or reverse engineer. It's a relationship, a bond built on trust and understanding." Sheriff Wilson's cruiser pulled up at that moment, its headlights illuminating the scene. Thomas could hear other vehicles approaching as well, community members responding to the deputy's call for assistance. Caught between Thunderclap's imposing presence and the growing number of witnesses, Palmer made a desperate decision. Thomas heard the metallic click of a gun being drawn, felt the air shift as the weapon was raised. "Enough games. We're leaving with those journals. Anyone who interferes will regret it." Time seemed to slow as Thomas processed the escalating danger. Ray and Deputy Roberts were armed, but in the confusion of darkness and multiple parties, a shootout could be catastrophic. Thomas needed to defuse the situation before it spiraled further. With calm deliberation, he raised the whistle once more to his lips. This time, the pattern was one he had never used before, a variation he had developed during his quiet evenings with Thunderclap over the past week, a command that didn't exist in his uncle's original system. The bull's response was immediate and astonishing. Instead of charging or threatening, Thunderclap moved with balletic precision, circling behind the intruders in a wide arc. The maneuver was so unexpected, so contrary to their understanding of bovine behavior, that Palmer and his associate momentarily froze in confusion. That hesitation was all Deputy Roberts needed. With practiced efficiency, he disarmed Palmer, while Ray tackled the second man. Within moments, Sheriff Wilson had joined them, handcuffs glinting in the headlights as the intruders were secured. "Federal agents will be very interested in what the Behavioral Dynamics Institute has been up to," Sheriff Wilson said grimly. "Breaking and entering, assault, corporate espionage, quite the list of charges." As the sheriff led the subdued intruders to his cruiser, Lily Carson pushed through the gathering crowd of neighbors to reach Thomas. "You're home," she gasped, having glimpsed the interior. "They've destroyed everything." Thomas shook his head. "Not everything, Lily. Not the things that matter." In the aftermath, as the community rallied around him, helping to restore order, through his ransacked cabin, Thomas found himself standing once again at the fence line with Thunderclap. Ray had given up on repairing the sections the bull kept breaking through, instead installing a proper gate between their properties. "Never seen anything like what you did tonight," Ray said, coming to stand beside Thomas. "That bull moved like he was part of your own body." Thomas reached out, feeling Thunderclap's warm breath against his palm. "That's the secret my uncle understood. It's not about control or domination. It's about connection, becoming so attuned to each other that the boundaries between separate beings start to blur." Over the following weeks, news of the incident spread through neighboring communities, eventually reaching national media. The Blind Whisperer, they called Thomas, a name he found both amusing and reductive. Journalists and researchers sought interviews, offering substantial sums for demonstrations of his techniques. Thomas declined them all, continuing his quiet life of crafting and now teaching. For in the wake of that night's events, something unexpected had blossomed in Whispering Pines, a renewed appreciation for the deeper bonds possible between humans and animals, and a desire to understand Thomas's methods not for profit or power, but for connection. He established a small school on Ray's property, with Thunderclap as his assistant instructor. Students came from across the country, many working with service animal organizations or rehabilitation programs. Thomas taught them the fundamentals of his uncle's techniques, adapted and expanded through his own unique perspective as a blind practitioner. "You could make a fortune selling this commercially," one corporate representative told him after observing a particularly impressive demonstration with Thunderclap. Thomas smiled, running his fingers along the smooth grain of a new whistle he was carving. "Some things aren't meant to be commodified," he replied. "My uncle understood that. It took me losing my sight to truly see it myself." On quiet evenings, Thomas still sat on his porch, listening to the sounds of his world, richer now, more nuanced than before. Sadie would doze at his feet, and often Thunderclap would stand at the gate between properties, his steady breathing a counterpoint to the whisper of wind through pine needles. In those moments, Thomas reflected on how his greatest vulnerability had become his greatest strength. Blindness had taught him to perceive the world differently, to recognize connections invisible to the seeing eye. The very thing those men had sought to exploit, his uncle's training system, was incomplete without the understanding that had come to Thomas through his own journey through darkness. The community of Whispering Pines had changed too. What began as protection for one of their own had evolved into something more profound, a collective recognition of the interconnectedness of all their lives. The weekly market now featured a special area where Thomas conducted public demonstrations, teaching children and adults alike about the subtle language of sounds and responses that existed just beyond human perception. "You've turned this whole town around," Lily told him one evening as they sat drinking lemonade after a community dinner. "People look at differences differently now, not as limitations, but as unique perspectives." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of Thunderclap's gaze from across the yard. The bull had become something of a local celebrity, his intelligent eyes and responsive nature challenging everything people thought they knew about animal consciousness. "We're all connected in ways we barely understand," Thomas replied, his fingers tracing the aged grain of his uncle's original whistle, now a treasured talisman rather than a mere tool. "Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to reveal the bonds that were there all along." As darkness settled, over the hills surrounding Whispering Pines, Thomas lifted the whistle to his lips and played a gentle series of notes, not a command, but a conversation. Across the yard, Thunderclap responded with a soft rumble, a sound that carried understanding beyond words. In that exchange, witnessed by neighbors who had become family, lay the true secret his uncle had discovered and Thomas had perfected, that the deepest communication transcends ordinary senses, crossing boundaries of species and circumstance to touch something universal and profound. The Institute men had sought a technique, a technology to be exploited and controlled. What they failed to understand was that the real power lay not in the method itself, but in the relationship it fostered, a bond forged through patience, respect, and the willingness to perceive the world through another's experience. For Thomas Blackwood, blindness had never been a tragedy but a transformation, opening his senses to realities others overlooked. And in Thunderclap, he had found not just a remarkable animal, but a mirror reflecting the truth that had guided him since losing his sight, that sometimes one must stop seeing in order to truly understand. Dear listeners, we hope Thomas and Thunderclap's extraordinary connection has touched your hearts. Their story reminds us that sometimes our greatest challenges can lead to our most profound strengths, and that true understanding often comes through unexpected bonds. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this tale of connection beyond sight, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring unique stories that explore life's complexity and the unexpected relationships that define us. We're eager to hear your thoughts. What unexpected connections have transformed your own life? Join us in the comments below and stay tuned for our next heartfelt narrative coming soon.